This video is about solving an equation using zero product property. Factor and solve a quadratic equation with an a value of 1, and factor and solve a quadratic equation with an a value other than 1. So when we look at these problems, we have to figure out what we are doing in each of these types of problems. So in number 1, we have x squared plus 3x plus 2. So in this problem, we're only going to factor. And when we factor here, we are going to box factor. So what we need to do then is we need to figure out what multiplies to 2 and adds to 3. Well, the only numbers that multiply to 2 are 2 and 1. So this would be x plus 2 times x plus 1. In our second part, we are going to GCF and then box factor because we don't have it as an x squared right now. So first, we'd have to divide everything by 4 to pull out our GCF, and we'd be left with x squared minus 10x plus 16. Then we can do our box factoring, so we can figure out what multiplies to 16 and adds to negative 10. So if we are multiplying to a positive number but adding to a negative, we'd have two negative numbers. So we'd have 4 times x minus 8 times x minus 2. Now, in the next two, the difference is that we have them set equal to 0, which means there's going to be more steps involved. So in this one, we would need to box factor and then use ZPP. So first we have to figure out what multiplies to negative 30 and adds to negative 7. So we want one of each sign. So those numbers would be negative 10 and 3. We have x minus 10 times x plus 3 equals 0. Then each part gets set equal to 0, so x minus 10 equals 0 and x plus 3 equals 0. So when we solve, in the first one we would add 10 to both sides, so x equals 10. In the second one we would subtract 3 from both sides, so x equals negative 3. In our last problem then, we have 3 steps that we need to do. So we need to GCF, we need to box factor, and we need to ZPP. So remember that you need to have it as an x squared, and it's an x cubed right now. So our GCF is x. We're going to put an x out front, and we're left with x squared plus 2x minus 8 equals 0. Then we're going to box factor. So what multiplies to negative 8 and adds to 2? So we want one of each sign. We'd have positive 4 and negative 2. So x times x plus 4 times x minus 2 equals 0. We're going to set each part equal to 0. So x equals 0, x plus 4 equals 0, and x minus 2 equals 0. So x equals 0, that's already solved. In the next one, we're going to subtract 4, so x equals negative 4. The second one, we're going to add 2, so x equals 2. Notice it was a third power, so we have 3 solutions. All right, so let's go through some examples. So in number 1, we have 8x squared plus 16x minus 192. So in this case, we are going to need to GCF and then box factor. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to take out an 8 as our GCF. So we're going to divide everything by 8. So we get x squared plus 2x minus 24. Then we're going to box factor. So what multiplies to negative 24 and adds to 2? So that would be 6 and negative 4. So we have 8 times x plus 6 times x minus 4. In number 2, we don't have an x squared. We have a 4x squared. So again, we need to GCF. So we're going to take an 4 out, and we're left with x squared minus 10x plus 16. So again, we need two numbers that multiply to 16 and add to negative 10. In this case, they both need to be negative. So we'd have negative 2, 8, and negative 2. So 4 times x minus 8 times x minus 2. In number 3, we have an x cubed minus 9x squared plus 14x. So each term has one too many x's, so that's going to be our GCF. And we're left with x squared minus 9x plus 14. So we need two numbers that multiply to 14 and add to negative 9. So both numbers need to be negative. We would have negative 7 and negative 2. X times x minus 7 times x minus 2. In number 4, in order to get our x squared, we need to take out a 5 and an x from each part. So 5x is our GCF. We're left with x squared plus 6x plus 9. So we need to figure out two numbers that multiply to 9 and add to 6. So those are 3 and 3. So we'd have 5x times x plus 3 times x plus 3. Because this is the same quantity, we can rewrite it as 5x times x plus 3 quantity squared. In number 5, to get an x squared, we would have a GCF of 5 in both places. So we have x squared minus 100. Now, there is no middle term here, so that's going to be adding to 0, and we are multiplying to negative 100. So we need the same number with different signs, so that would be 10 and negative 10. So we'd have 5 times x plus 10 times x minus 10. In number 6, we already have an x squared, so we don't need to GCF this time. This time we can just straight factor with our box. So what multiplies to 2 and adds to 3? The only numbers are 2 and 1. We'd have x plus 2 and x plus 1. In number 7, to get an x squared, our GCF would be 2x. So we'd be left with x squared minus x minus 72. So we need two numbers that multiply to negative 72 and add to negative 1. So those numbers would be negative 9 and 8. We have 2x times x minus 9 times x plus 8. In number 8, our GCF is 3. So we'd have a 3 out front. We'd be left with x squared minus 6x plus 9. So we need two numbers that multiply to 9 and add to negative 6. So that would be negative 3 and negative 3. They both need to be negative in this case. So we have 3 times x minus 3 times x minus 3, which we can rewrite then as 3 times the quantity x minus 3 squared. In number 9, our GCF is going to be 4. So we're left with x squared minus x minus 20. We need two numbers that multiply to negative 20 and add to negative 1. So we want one of each sign. And the bigger number is going to be negative. So we would have negative 5 and 4. So it'd be 4 times x minus 5 times x plus 4. Now, the next problems are going to have an equal sign in them. So this time, we need to factor and solve. Remember when you are factoring that if you have a degree of 2, there will be 2 solutions. If you have a degree of 3, there will be 3 solutions. So in number 10, we have x squared minus 10 equals 9x. Now, we can't factor yet because it has to be equal to 0 first. So we are going to subtract 9x from both sides. So we get x squared minus 9x minus 10 is equal to 0. Remember, the x term always needs to be in the middle. So we need two numbers that multiply to negative 10 and add to negative 9. So a lot of us are probably thinking 2 and 5, but there's no way to get that to add to negative 9. So two other numbers that multiply to 10 are negative 10 and 1. So we'd have x minus 10 times x plus 1 equals 0. Then because we are equal to 0, we are solving for x. So we would have x minus 10 equals 0 and x plus 1 equals 0. In the first part, we would add 10, so x equals positive 10. And then we would subtract negative 1, so x equals negative 1. In number 11, it is not an x squared, it's a 4x squared, so we need to factor out a GCF first of 4. That leaves us with x squared minus 8x plus 12 is equal to 0. So now we need two numbers that multiply to 12 and add to negative 8. So those numbers are negative 6 and negative 2. So we would have 4 times x minus 6 times x minus 2 equals 0. So anywhere we have an x, we set it equals 0. So x plus 6 equals 0 and x minus 2 equals 0. Add 6 to both sides and x equals 6. Add 2 to both sides and x equals 2. In number 12, it's x cubed minus 14x squared plus 40x equals 0. So everything has one too many x's, so our GCF is going to be x, and that leaves us then with x squared minus 14x plus 48 equals 0. So we need two numbers that multiply to 48 and add to negative 14, so that would be negative 8 and negative 6. So we have x times x minus 8 times x minus 6 equals 0. This time there are three x's, so they all get set equal 0, x equals 0, x minus 8 equals 0, and x minus 6 equals 0. So x equals 0 is already solved, and the next one we add 8 to both sides, so x equals 8, and then we add 6 to both sides, so x equals 6. Notice that our degree was 3, so we have 3 solutions. In 13, our GCF is going to be 2x, so that we can get this become x squared. So that leaves us with x squared plus 7x plus 6 equals 0. So we need two numbers that multiply to 6 and add to 7. So 2 and 3 are not going to work. Instead, we need 1 and 6. So we have 2x times x plus 1 times x plus 6 equals 0. This time when we solve, there are going to be 3 solutions because we have an exponent to the third in our original. So 2x equals 0, x plus 1 equals 0, and x plus 6 equals 0. So we're going to divide by 2, so x equals 0. We're going to subtract 1, so x equals negative 1. And we're going to subtract 6, so x equals negative 6.